And welcome back. I hope you've all been doing well. Tonight we're going to cover part 2 of our short series on the Linux file system. As mentioned in the first part, this video is geared toward the newer user and those watching who may be curious about the different directories in the file system for Linux. For those who may have missed the first part, we covered the bin, boot, dev, etc, home, lib, media, mount, and optional directories. We didn't go into a ton of detail about those directories, but we essentially covered the basics of what they are and what's contained in them. So tonight we're going to cover the proc, root, run, sbin, SRV, sys, temp, user, and var directories, and pretty much the same format as part 1. This is to keep everything fairly consistent. Before we get started, allow me to remind those of you who watched part 1 and those of you who are just joining us for the first time, my inspiration for this video came from an image I ran across on Twitter that was posted by the ByteByteGo account. All right, I think that's enough rambling, so thank you in advance for watching, and let's get to it. All right, let's start off with a quick discussion of what a file system is. Essentially, and at a very basic level, the file system is the organization of stored files in this case, your Linux install. The best analogy I can think of is to think of a parts rack at your local auto parts store. And I know that sounds wild, but that's just the first analogy that came to my mind. Each bin holds specific parts that all serve different and specific purposes. The Linux file system is one of the many things I really love about Linux itself. Everything is kept organized in easy and accessible directories. Everything where it should be. Once you learn the file system, which is one of the first things I encourage every Linux user to do, using Linux becomes much easier. Now, not to get sidebarred here, but if you allow me a quick digression, I encourage all new users to consider learning the Linux file system and learning how to use the terminal. Now, it is true that because of how far desktop environments and package managers have come, you could use your Linux distro without ever or being required to ever use the terminal. But by using it and learning the commands, you'll learn so much more about Linux and your particular distro. And the same goes for learning the file system. It's most certainly worth the effort, and honestly, with so many guides out there, it really doesn't take that much effort. Again, that's just my encouragement and recommendation. I intentionally want to keep these videos as relatable, I guess, maybe, and understandable as possible. Because as a Linux user, and just a quick little history on me, I started using Linux a very long time ago, back when you had to compile our own drivers for things like LAN cards. And for some of you younger folks who may have never used a LAN card before, I'll just say it was a long time ago. And we used to get our distros on CDs from PC magazines. So fast forwarding a little bit to today, I know how frustrating it can be to ask a simple question like, how do I configure my racing wheel on my Linux computer? And then getting met with an answer like,
Mr. Barkley, everyone's still trying to figure out exactly how you did it.
Well, it just occurred to me that I could set up a frequency harmonic between the deflector and the shield grid using the warp field generator as a power flow anti-attenuator, and that, of course, naturally created an amplification of the inherent energy output.
Of course, you're left scratching your head and wondering what the hell you've gotten yourself into. That's where I come in and trying to offer guides and explanations that are a little more digestible for the newer users. All right, so let's start off with the Proc Directory. The Proc Directory is a bit unusual, if that's a term I can use, in that it's a dynamic virtual file system. The file system holds information about your hardware. It also holds information about the processes you have running. Keep in mind that all the data in Linux is kept as a file, but with the Proc Directory, those files are virtual. So what does that mean? Well, it means that when your system boots up, these files are created, and then they're deleted when you shut the system down or reboot. One thing I probably should have mentioned at the start is that proc is short for, as you probably have already guessed, process. In fact, you might find it helpful to remember that directories are typically just shortened words for the directory's actual name. For example, bin is short for binary, etc is short for etc, proc is short for process, and you get the idea. Of course, some directory titles are just what they are, meaning that they are not shortened like root, boot, and media. So thinking about the Proc Directory for a moment, when your computer is on, you have active and running processes. When the computer is off, those processes are no longer active, right? So it makes sense that any virtual files related to those active processes would be deleted when the computer is turned off or rebooted. To wrap it up, the Proc Directory is otherwise known as the process directory, and it contains virtual files that are created when the computer is booted up and destroyed when the computer is shut down. These virtual files contain information about your hardware and running processes. All right, so moving on, we have the root directory. As you can imagine, the root directory contains all the directories in your Linux install. And I'll show that to you here on the screen. You can kind of see the structure. So basically all the directories we're talking about are contained inside of the root directory. Now we'll take a quick look at the run directory. This directory contains temporary files that are generated during the booting process. The types of files we're talking about here are files like PIDs, which are just process identifiers. Also, this directory is where sockets are kept. Sockets basically allow different processes to communicate. There are other types of files that are kept here too, like lock files. But we're not going to dive down deep into each and every type of file that's found in the Linux file system. That would take a very, very long time. Now, we haven't talked about the temp directory yet, but we are getting there. But I do want to mention something that when we cover the temp directory, you might ask yourself, why have a run directory where temporary files are kept, and we have a temp directory at the same time, also where temporary files are kept? Well, there are issues that can arise if the data in the run directory from one boot is not deleted during the second booting of your computer. But I think the best way to explain the difference between run and temp to newer folks is that temp directory is for temporary files generated by the user or a program, while the run directory is runtime data needed for your system's operation. Also, users typically don't need to mess with the run directory. Okay, so next up we have the Sbin Directory. We've already talked about the bin directory in part 1 of the series, so if you haven't seen that, I encourage you to check that out. They're both directories that hold binaries, and of course there's a difference. This is Linux after all. Well, the bin directory contains basic commands used by the user for regular activities. The Sbin is more for commands used by higher level users like system admins. A couple of examples of commands you might find in the Sbin are add user and fdisk. And fdisk is what you use to partition your physical drive. Okay, so let's take a brief look at the SRV directory. As you might have guessed, the SRV directory stands for service. This directory holds files for web servers and FTP servers. A quick example here, if you're running a web server, the associated HTTP files would be contained in here. All right, moving right along to the SYS, or you guessed it, system directory. This directory holds information on your drivers, devices, and the kernel. It's similar to Proc, but I think for a new user, the best way to think about the differences here is that the Proc directory focuses on process and the sys directory focuses on devices. That's very simplistic, but hopefully that sort of illustrates the point. Now we'll get to the temp directory, which we talked about previously. This directory is used to house temporary files that are created by applications and the OS. Basically, your system and the applications you might use require temporary short-lived data for operation. This is the type of data stored in this directory. Now I'm going to do another little combination here, and I'm going to combine another directory into this talk, and that's the VAR directory. VAR is short for variable files. It's very similar to the temp directory, but they differ primarily in, I guess you could say, in longevity of the lifespan of the file. So let me explain a little bit. Files in the var directory may be more persistent and may actually survive a reboot, need to survive a reboot. An example of this might be a log file, where in the temp directory may hold session files, and those files are not necessary on the next reboot. Sounds a little confusing? If it is, please let me know in the comments, and I can try to offer a better explanation in an upcoming video. So this leaves us with our last directory, the USR directory. As the name implies, USR stands for User System Resources. This directory is where most of the user apps and utilities are kept. It contains a lot of the libraries and tools needed for software execution and user-level operations. Okay, so on a final note, before we wrap this up, keep in mind that many of these directories have... Stop fighting! On a final note, before we wrap this up, keep in mind that many of these directories have subdirectories within. For example, the user directory has a user bin subdirectory where binaries for application executables are kept. All right, so that wraps up part 2, the final part of this very short series. I hope you've gotten some value out of it and taken something away from it. I'll be working on a video for next week, and I'm planning on going over the terminal, which will also be directed more at new users and those curious about Linux. As always, thank you for watching. I hope to see you in the next video. If you do like this content, consider subscribing, as it really does help me out a lot. Stay safe out there and have a good one. And a real quick note here for those curious, Tanjiro and Junior are my Russian blue. Well, Junior is the Russian blue and Tanjiro is a tabby. They're both very young males that are still playing, and sometimes they get a little bit too rough with each other, so I have to break them up.